morning, everybody. Thank you for coming out for the early morning panel. We were discussing that we should have had some sort of awards for you all live, but we failed on that regard, so I apologize. But your reward is going to be to get to hear from some of the greatest and best advocates and activists working on foreign policy in the U.S. right now. And we're going to have a conversation today about the Yemen war in particular and the campaigns to stop the U.S. involvement in it. And the reason we're going to be talking about that is because it is going to open up a conversation about how we work on foreign policy generally, and also how we can win, right? I think most of us are interested in not just having policy battles and activist campaigns, but actually making progress and advancing and changing what's really broken in the United States foreign policy. And Yemen is a great story of success in that regard. So we're going to get started here in a second. I have three amazing panelists to my left. We're going to have today's panel as a conversational style. So we're going to kick it off in a minute, and we are going to save some time at the end for audience Q&A. And so if you really want to ask a question, you've got about 45 minutes to think really hard now about what you want to ask, and we'll get there a little bit later in the conversation. So I'm going to start with my immediate left, Jehan Hakim. Jehan is the chair of the Yemeni Alliance Committee, and she's also a board member of Just Foreign Policy. Both organizations have been very active in the fight to end the war in Yemen. Jehan's been particularly active in the Bay Area, where she calls home, where she has been leading protests, organizing actions, and doing direct advocacy and conversations with their members of Congress. I hear they have some particularly important members of Congress in the Bay Area. And so Jehan's going to kick us off. And Jehan, I thought you could set the stage for us here. Talk a little bit about how this war started, who the players are, and what's been going on.
Morning, everyone.
Morning.
Morning. Coming through. I don't know about y'all, but I didn't have my coffee yet, so bear with me if I sound a little scratchy. As you all know, 2010, a democratic spirit kind of spread through the MENA and began in Tunisia and Egypt and Libya, and then, I'm so sorry, and then Yemen also, found or felt it was a great opportunity to also revolt after years of 33-year-long dictator, and even before that, there's been a lot of discontent due to Yemen being run by tribalism. So there hasn't been a formal mechanism to really, structure the way the government should be run. Youth in a lot of marginalized communities, including the Houthis, took it to the streets in January, including, if you've heard of, Yemen. So even you've seen women on the streets, and it was something that wasn't the norm. Folks felt that it was their time to shine, and you heard chants, and people took it to this circle called Change Circle in Sana'a, in the capital, where they rallied and they slept and they ate, and you found folks who were heavily armed, side by side with your regular Yemeni. And Yemen is the second most armed country, second to the U.S. Protests were peaceful, even though you had folks with AK-47s. Like I said in the beginning, it began peaceful, and myself and my community and my family watched from afar as the MENA was just lit up, unfortunately. But we were kind of hopeful, to be honest with you, because the regime in Yemen, just like it was in a lot of the other Middle Eastern countries, was not representative, and definitely not democratic. So it wasn't until the Islah Party, which is the Muslim Brotherhood of Yemen, got involved, that they took the opportunity to also, there's a power vacuum, so they wanted to fill it by wanting to oust Abdullah Saleh, the 33-year-old dictator. He's not 33-year-old. The 33-year dictator. So then that's when Houthis and the Islah Party got into a tiff, and there was armed conflict at the time. Wanted to really touch on who the Houthis are, because I think there's a lot of minimizing about the war in Yemen, like it's a sectarian issue, like it's a Sunni-Shia conflict, when actually the Zaydi branch, where the Houthis subscribe to, is closer to Sunniism. Zaydism is an ideology, and the Houthi movement is a political group that's a local regional group that some have said have been inspired by the Iranian Revolution. So fast forward, I'm not going to give you a whole history lesson, but fast forward until 2014. And in 2014, the Houthis marched from Sa'ada, so they're in the northwest part of Sana'a, the mountainous areas. They marched down to Sana'a and took over the capital. So they had demands. The revolution really wanted a reformation of the political system, and the Houthis as well wanted to be represented. They, along with a lot of other folks who weren't among the political elite, were not represented in local government. They took over the government and wanted the demands that the people were requesting, in addition to what they were asking for, to be met, to be fulfilled. That didn't happen. A year later, they, in between this time, Abdullah Saleh stepped down, and Mansour Hadi was appointed, who was his longtime VP. In 2015, the Houthis put Mansour Hadi on house arrest, kind of like forcing him to take action, to follow through with the demands that the Yemeni government had, all the promises that they made, especially after they signed the unity agreement, where the parties would have some kind of representation in government. So after that happened, Hadi fled, and that's when there were conversations with the GCC, the Gulf Cooperation Council, which includes Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and other Gulf partners. And that's when the conversation of intervention happened. The locals, the civil war was, I guess it couldn't be contained. So the Hadi government then sought help or assistance from the intervention. And on March 26, in 2015, the Saudi-led coalition, which consists of Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Bahrain, Kuwait, Morocco, Senegal, and Sudan, I believe. I mentioned Bahrain, Egypt and Sudan. Qatar was removed in 2017, but that's when Saudi-led airstrikes bombarded Sana'a. So what this did is it escalated a civil war into a regional inferno. I think a lot of people, hearing this narrative think that Yemen was a utopia before. No, we definitely recognize that there are internal factions. But having foreign characters like Saudi-led coalition, which is supported and backed by the United States, really escalated the war, and I'll go into what the impact looks like in a second, but it's devastating. So what is the coalition doing, and who are their partners? The US, the UK, France provide intelligence, mid-air refueling. Well, up until recently, we have heard that mid-air refueling has stopped. But we also provide training of soldiers. And the really, really big piece here is we also sell weapons. We sell weapons to the Saudi-led coalition, and these bombs that are falling on the people of Yemen and on children in their neighborhoods, Obviously after the explosion occurs, then used to find shells and different pieces, remaining residual effects on the ground, and they do know that these bombs are made in the USA. It says that on the bombs. So just to give you a little bit of data, according to the Yemen Data Project, found that more than 18,000 Saudi air raids have been carried out in Yemen, with almost 1/3 of bombing missions striking non-military sites. These sites have been hospitals, funerals. If you remember last year, the school bus that was hit, I believe later on the Saudi media mentioned that it was a mistake. But it's a mistake. We are giving that intelligence. So who's that mistake on? So the impact. What does the impact look like? Since March 26th of 2015, over 80,000 Yemenis have been killed. And it's very hard to capture what this number looks like. So this is definitely underestimating. Some outlets have said over 90,000. I'm trying to be, modest here and say 80,000 because I don't want to hear 90. That's close to 100. Over 80% of Yemenis are in need of humanitarian aid. Over 16 million Yemenis lack access to health care. Something to think about when you're trying to advocate for Medicare for all, which is important to all of us Americans. Over 15 million lack access to clean water, and a lot of these water plants have been bombed by the coalition. And this has birthed the world's worst cholera outbreak. There have been over 1 million cases of cholera, and cholera is spread very quickly through contaminated water. So there's lack water, lack clean water, and then here comes this cholera outbreak. I think we're in the 3rd largest outbreak since the war, because it ebbs and flows. 90% lack access to electricity. I remember when I visited Yemen, I stayed there for a year back in '96. That shows you how old I am. But even then, the electricity was not consistent. We'd always have candles on standby. It was just a regular thing. So I can imagine what it looks like under hovering warplanes and missiles and airstrikes. And in 2015 and 2017, at least 113,000 children died due to malnutrition and preventable diseases such as cholera or diphtheria. Half of the population is facing famine. If the war continues, famine could engulf the whole country, with 15 million on the brink of starvation. Nearly 400,000 children suffer from severe malnutrition, meaning they won't know when their next meal will be, or maybe they've gone days. Not going to take too much time, but want to draw quick attention to the 4th largest city in Yemen, which is called Al-Hudaida, which is Yemen's lifeline. Over 70% of imports come through this port, and we import the majority of our goods. We even import water. The UN has warned warring parties that not to attack Al-Hudaida because a threat to Al-Hudaida can mean mass starvation for the whole country. With respect to displacement, you don't find a lot of Yemeni refugees, definitely not in the States. Actually, since 2015, 0 Yemenis have entered as refugees. Of course, Yemen is still on the Muslim ban list, so even Yemeni American U.S. citizens who have married or they have children back home, they cannot bring their children due to the Muslim ban. So much less come in as a refugee. So basically, Yemen is being banned by the country that is helping bomb them. And then if you do find refugees, Yemenis will go to neighboring countries such as Djibouti or Eritrea. There are hundreds of thousands of Yemenis in Djibouti. I used to work in immigration, and we have folks stuck there due to Muslim ban. Like, they have visas, but they're not able to come in. So they're not those who are plagued by cholera or hunger. They are those who have family here and are not able to enter. I'm not gonna rant too much, but a couple of interviews and conversations that we've had with our folks back home. Like I said, the people of Yemen know what's happening, and a question they asked, and we'll show a video later, is what did we do? Why are they bombing us? So quickly, that's kind of in a nutshell what is happening in Yemen. It's according to the UN, the world's worst humanitarian crisis that we've seen in decades, and the war doesn't look like it's going to stop anytime soon. But we're going to talk about some great things where folks can plug in to really help uplift and amplify our efforts. Thank you.
Thank you, Jehan. We're gonna do a quick 30-second video that Jehan has recently shot footage in Yemen, and I think you want to introduce anything else.
Sure, yeah, we have one of our team members that is going to go anonymous because she's worried about her family's safety in Yemen. But she is in Sana'a, and this is a family of 5, and their house in the capital was impacted by an airstrike, a cellular airstrike. So they had to move to a smaller area, and they're here in kind of like a shack, a family of 5 in a shack. And she's been asked, the first question was, how was life like after the war? She's gonna answer it, and then I'm gonna translate it for you guys. Oh, sorry. She's in 6th grade.
كنا زعلانين لأن أمريكا كانت تبيع للسعودية الأسلحة.
So the question was, how is life like after the war? So we were really upset because the USA sells Saudi weapons.
إذا منهم أن لا يبيعوا لهم الأسلحة.
We want them to stop selling Saudi Arabia weapons.
نريد الدمار في اليمن وما فعلت فيهم اليمن يضر.
We don't want the crisis in Yemen to continue. What do the people of Yemen do?
أنت ليش زعلانة؟ لأن أمريكا تبيع للسعودية الأسلحة والسعودية يجوا يضربوا اليمن.
So the question was, why are you upset? She said, because the USA sells Saudi Arabia weapons, and then those weapons bomb us in here in Yemen.
Just gonna let that sit in for a second. Thank you, John. We're gonna move next to Layla Picard. Layla is the founder and the executive director of the Yemen Peace Project, which she'll tell you more about in a moment. Layla is a graduate of Philadelphia's own Penn, which I found out recently. So welcome back to Philly, even though she has the misfortune of living on the other side of the state. I won't let her answer. And she's been researching, studying, and working on the Middle East, and in particular Yemen, for a number of years. Layla, the Yemen Peace Project was one of the earliest NGOs focused on shifting U.S. policy towards the war. And I think it's important to understand, as Jehan just pointed out, this war started under the Obama administration. It's been continued under the Trump administration. The U.S. support for this war has been a bipartisan effort in Washington, and that is not something that should be forgotten in this conversation. Layla, can you tell us a little bit about those early days of working on this war, what it was like to try to get attention to it, and how you guys did?
Yeah, sure. So the Yemen Peace Project has actually been around for about a decade now, which means we started out long before this war. Our early focus in those first years was on the U.S. counterterrorism program in Yemen primarily. and on trying to shift that away from such a militarized counterterrorism program. We also played a small supporting role for the peaceful youth uprising in 2011. We organized Yemen's first international film and arts festivals in 2014 and 2016. So we spent a lot of time trying to educate the public in this country about Yemen and about the impact of U.S. policy there. When this war started, though, we hadn't actually been doing a lot of formal lobbying up until that point. We realized we had to make a change there. It was because we had no staff and no money, and I was at the time based in California, so it was very difficult for me to do it in person. But once the war began and U.S. support for the Saudi-led intervention began, I started making more regular trips to Capitol Hill and started connecting with organizations that were here and could do more lobbying than they currently were. We launched our first constituent action along with Americans for Human Rights and Democracy in Bahrain at the end of 2015, calling on people to email their Congress people to try to stop U.S. support for the coalition, the Saudi-led coalition. And so back then, 2015, we weren't the only organization doing this at the time. You had Oxfam, HOMED, Human Rights Watch, Amnesty, and ADHRB, which I just mentioned. They'd all spoken with legislators about the situation in Yemen, but there were a number of other prominent organizations in Washington that worked on the Middle East that really didn't have Yemen on their radar yet. So one of the things that was really an important part of my job at the time was just going around and meeting with my peers at different organizations and urging them to dedicate some of their advocacy bandwidth to Yemen. At the time, folks at Oxfam and Amnesty were organizing occasional conference calls and trying to coordinate campaigns opposing specific U.S. arms sales to Saudi Arabia. But other than that, there was no concerted effort or coordinated lobby on Yemen in place yet. We hired our first advocacy director at the very beginning of 2017. We were very lucky to hire Kate Kaiser, who I had worked with when she was at ADHRB and is now the policy director at Women.org. And Kate very quickly became one of the central hubs of this nascent Yemen lobby that was forming. Adding to our luck, she brought with her another ADHRB alum, Eric Eichenberry, who worked as her deputy and then took over as our advocacy director in 2018. And if you've never worked with Eric or Kate, you don't really know the full extent of what a human being can accomplish in a single day. These two are absolutely tireless and are both still working on Yemen outside of the YPP and really helped to pull together this coordinated lobby that we see today. So since 2016, we've gone from scattershot meetings on the Hill and occasional conference calls to a well-oiled machine that's very centrally coordinated and is managed through literally constant communication among more than a dozen advocacy organizations, much larger than the Yemen Peace Project. And because of this high level of coordination and cooperation, we have passed legislation on Yemen, and we've literally changed the parameters of what members of Congress think is possible in a situation like this. Unfortunately, though, while we've been able to build a really strong coalition among NGOs and now a grassroots movement against the war in Yemen is quite powerful, we ended up really straining or losing a lot of the relationships that the Yemen Peace Project had with our original constituency, which was the Yemeni diaspora. The war and the propaganda that came with it have really polarized the diaspora like nothing before, not even the revolution in 2011. So within, I think, the first few months of 2015, after the Saudi-led intervention began in particular, the propaganda that was coming out of the pro-Saudi side really their main point was, if you say anything in opposition to the war, say the war is bad and it should be stopped, then you are a Houthi sympathizer. And that really had a way of shutting down debate. And it meant that, within a few months, about half of our Yemeni American contacts who we've been working with for 6 years stopped talking to us, and a lot of the rest were just, I think, emotionally exhausted and frustrated by what was going on and didn't really have the energy to engage in political actions. So at this point, there are several very crucially important Yemeni American activists who are working on this. Obviously Jehan, but also Aisha Jaman and Shireen Al-Ademi, among others. But a huge portion of the Yemeni American community has really not been engaged in the effort against the war for very understandable reasons. So that's a big limitation that we face. It took, I think, a couple of years, probably 2 years or so, to get to the point where this advocacy coalition could really make a major impact on not just legislation, but the U.S. media environment, and get to the point where it was, now it's pretty commonplace for journalists to, and for commentators and pundits to, espouse the idea that this war is damaging to Yemen, but also the United States and the region, and that the U.S. support for the Saudi-led coalition is legally questionable. It took a long time for us to sort of move those ideas into the mainstream here, and it wouldn't have happened really without that strong coordinated effort. When we started out the YPP in 2010, there was no attention being paid to Yemen. There was no powerful coalition of NGOs working on this, and just to see how much attention is paid now is still not enough. But the change that we've seen in the last decade and in the last 4 years has been unprecedented.
Thank you, Layla. We're gonna continue on that theme by having our next speaker, Iram Ali, who is a senior campaign director at MoveOn, a fledgling internet organization folks may have heard of. Iram is going to talk in a second. Oh, so prior to joining MoveOn, Iram also worked at Iraq Veterans Against the War and has been active on these issues for a number of years. And I want to ask you, Iram, to pick up on that point we just heard. It took a while to get larger, more mainstream organizations involved. And so I want you to kind of tell us a little bit about what was the process like for MoveOn to get involved, and then also tell us a little bit about what's happened in the last 2 years since you guys had.
Good morning. Can everyone hear me? Okay, awesome. So that's a great question. I think and I can only speak on behalf of MoveOn. I can't really say why other progressive organizations are or are not involved in this fight. For MoveOn, it's like we are a multi-issue organization, and when things come on our radar, it's always gut checking where our members are, where the energy is, and is there a strategic fight here where we can move not only the narrative, but actually get to a pathway towards victory, right? And one thing that I will say is foreign policy in general does not have a strong base. In terms of when you think about everyday people, the issues that are hitting them closest might be like healthcare. It might be, getting the next friend. And thinking about people overseas that might be impacted, or people within their own communities who have relatives overseas that might be impacted, it can be a stretch, right? So instead, they would rather focus on their immediate needs, which is human nature. But when I was approached, it was early 2018, and organizations were like, hey, you guys gotta pay attention to Yemen, and what's going on here, and oh, by the way, Rouhani is leading the War Powers Resolution in the House, and there's going to be a vote soon. So there was like some tangible thing that we could hold on to and tell our members about. Like, hey, there's a vote coming up, and this might impact U.S. involvement in Yemen and actually shut it down if we are successful, right? So the theory of change essentially was there. And still, it was still hard to get people to pay attention, but at that point, I decided this was the fight that MoveOn should be involved in. And I think that speaks to also like who is within organizations that can actually pick up these fights and then lead them even when the energy isn't there, and even when it may not be an organizational priority otherwise, right? So like equity needs to, progressive organizations need to inculcate equity in order for them to know that they are going to fight and pick the right issues, right? Because they have the right people in the organization working on them. So for me, I saw this as a moral imperative. There is no way to ignore what's happening in Yemen and the U.S. involvement in Yemen as a progressive organization. It is against our principles, right? just the sheer catastrophe that we are involved in is unexplicable. So when I heard that there was going to be a vote in the House, everyone was thinking, hey, maybe we should have a press conference. What should we do? And it was literally like, the vote is next week, and this was like March 2018. And I was like, you know what? It's Friday. I think the vote is going to be next Wednesday, but we'll get it together. And what I wanted to do was show a visual of like what's happening, right? And what it ended up looking like was having 5,000 flowers laying on the lawn in front of the Capitol building to visualize that this was impacting real people. And we picked the number 5,000 because at the time, like, the number of kids who had been killed at the conflict was so low. Months later, we would realize the number is actually like 85,000 children who have died, right? And that press conference got a lot of attention. And some of my peers, like here, were present along with, other organizations. And that really, like, got attention. There was a visual out there, and people started to pay attention. And it was a narrative that I could bring back to our members and say, here's something that we did, and here's where we're going. And the reason why I thought this was an important fight is because it actually lays the groundwork for progressive foreign policy, right? If we win here, if we win on Yemen, we are laying the groundwork for repealing the 2001 authorization. We are laying the groundwork for repealing the 2002 Iraq War authorization, and we're laying the groundwork for what it means to actually contribute on a global stage and not fund regimes with human rights abuses on a wide scale, not just Saudi Arabia, right? So that's really why I wanted MoveOn to be involved, and MoveOn saw the opportunity and was like, yes, this is the fight that we need to be involved in.
Thank you, Iram. I realized I didn't tell you who the heck I was. My name is Stephen Miles. I'm the executive director of Win Without War, and we wanted to organize this panel today because we wanted to have these amazing leaders who have been working on this issue for so many years in so many different ways, folks we've partnered with in our own work on this issue, and really represented the kind of coalitions that we think we need to put together to win, not just on progressive foreign policy, but on progressive policies in general. Expert communities, frontline communities, the large mobilization and multi-issue organizations. This is what winning coalitions look like. And to underscore that, we've heard about the realities of the war. We've heard about how hard it was to get folks involved. We've heard about getting mobilized. Just yesterday, for what is now the third or fourth time, the House of Representatives, in bipartisan votes, voted to both block all U.S. participation in the war in Yemen and to stop selling arms to Saudi Arabia because of the war in Yemen. Now, a lot of conversation in Washington, and particularly in the elite media, portrays this all as if it's just some sort of response to the horrific murder of Jamal Khashoggi that happened in October of last year. And we'd be remiss if we didn't say that that absolutely played a part in this, that absolutely played a role in highlighting the horrific abuses of the Saudi-led government. But what you're hearing today is the reality that that moment came on top of years and years of work that's often not in the spotlight, that's often not seen, but is the hard work of bringing these issues to the fore, putting people in place to work on them, doing that kind of education that it takes to get them on the agenda in Washington, and then mobilizing the political force to win on those issues. And we're gonna continue this conversation, but I really wanted to take a moment to underscore that's why you're hearing from this diversity of opinions. That's why you're hearing the different perspectives on how we approach this work. And it is ultimately a success story because right now we are on the cusp of having accomplished things that when we started, not only had never been done, but were laughed out of the room as impossible ideas to even contemplate. So I think it really is a remarkable story. I'm deeply grateful to my colleagues for working on it. And we're gonna pivot back into the conversation, but I wanted to underscore that. Layla and Jehan, you both talked about, actually all three of you talked about people. Right? There's gonna be a candidate who talks to Netroots later today who famously says personnel is policy. So people do matter. And one theme that I suspect folks in the room will have heard at other panels at Netroots, and I know has been a theme for a number of years at Netroots, is the need to center frontline voices, the need to center impacted communities. The famous saying by Congressman Presley, those closest to the power, or pain should be closest to the power. We hear this a lot, but it's not that simple. And I wonder if you might both talk about, some of the challenges of that, and Jehan in particular. I think there's a question that a lot of folks have: how do they be good allies, right? How do they show up and support? How do they not just drown out because of all the inequities that are involved, the voices of those actually closest? How do we show up, and how do we support that desire to center folks?
That is the best question ever. Legit, I think it's important for allies to understand this question on a deeper level about issues that concern other marginalized people. You know, as a visibly Muslim woman, it's very easy to be tokenized and used as a cover of a grant report, which has happened before. But I think what makes this dynamic, this coalition of folks that you see up here and those that you don't see is, you know, we're colleagues, and there's a lot of like respect and courtesy, and they do listen. And I think that's the key for being a good ally, is we are directly impacted. So we a lot of times are leading the conversation. And you know, these are the legal experts. So we do take advice and strategy lessons from them, but our folks are on the ground, and our folks are being impacted, and we're in direct communication with them. We're also impacted, just as we here at home, you know, look at folks in the border where children are being ripped away from their families, and you're seeing pictures and videos of tears and separation. Those are things that we can also relate to as being Yemeni Americans, having families being ripped away from their families, and not just their immigration mechanism or default or a gap or a broken system, but through war and devastation and hunger. So I think quick answer to that question is just to listen. Listen to folks that are impacted. And while they may not be attorneys or experts, you know, the people of Yemen should have the autonomy to advocate for what they want for their country, outside of any intervention, outside of any lens that doesn't live and exist in the country or the region that is being, you know, bombed. So I think listen and follow the lead of people who are directly impacted. And I think this is the case for across the board. People of color, they want to be listened to, and they know what they want for their people. They are the best advocates for their cause. And I think, like I said, this dynamic here is the way it is. You know, we text each other, and we're in communication. And what do you think of this? What do you think of that? We're coordinating legit. You know what I mean? And I think that's what really makes things happen. And I think that's where you know, shifts in policy can happen, is when folks are at the center, not just to be tokenized. They're listened to, they're followed, and then there's an active follow-up on a coordinated level.
I want to follow up on that a little bit by talking about, you know, why it's so important to listen and what happens when we don't listen, and then, you know, wrap up by giving y'all a picture of exactly what that looks like to do it. You know, the advocacy and lobbying process really has a way of narrowing one's vision if we're not careful. So we all want to end the war and the suffering in Yemen. We've developed in the U.S. and the advocacy community a theory of change that says that the best way we can do that is by ending U.S. military support for the Saudi-led intervention. But because the executive branch is so compromised by military contractors and by the Gulf states, and because Congress is so dysfunctional, the task of opposing arms sales alone very quickly becomes a full-time job for dozens of lobbyists. And that means that our goal of ending the war gets narrowed down to this goal of stopping the arms sale. Our research, though, shows that most people in Yemeni civil society don't know at all that we're doing anything in the U.S. to affect the course of this war. And the few people who do know that, all they really see is that we want to stop arming the coalition. They want to end the war too. Yemeni civil society wants to end the war. They have a different theory of change. They don't see, they don't share our theory about that, our vision of how to end the war, and their ideas of how to stop this war don't put ending missile sales at the top of the list. So they don't really understand why our agenda does. We need, I think, to be open then, not just to listening, but to actually broadening our approach to these problems and connecting it with theirs in Yemen. We also have to reckon with the fact that what we say over here isn't said in a vacuum. And the parties to this conflict in Yemen have been very adept at taking what's said in the U.S. in this debate and using it for their own purposes. The Houthis have co-opted every anti-war talking point and used it to justify what they call their resistance to foreign aggression, which means that the Saudis and the UAE then use that to say that any opposition to their intervention is pro-Houthi. And that's, very counterproductive. When we go to people on the ground directly, though, and when we work directly with Yemeni civil society, we're able to circumvent those rulers, those state propaganda machines. And that means that we have a chance to put forward, in both directions, a credible agenda. We can show Americans that we have a Yemeni-informed agenda here, these policy recommendations we have. We can show Yemeni civil society that they have a credible, good faith partner in the U.S. who's trying to influence policymakers toward the ends that they envision, not just what we envision. So how do you actually connect with people on the ground in a country like Yemen? At the beginning of this year, the YPP basically shut down our lobbying and direct advocacy practice and pivoted to a new kind of advocacy, what we call the Empower Yemen initiative. And what we're doing is really simple. We're basically sending questionnaires about issues that are relevant to U.S. policy to activists and civil society folks across Yemen. We are analyzing and translating their responses and sharing them with the advocacy community, with key congressional offices, and with the public. And it's not the case that there are currently no Yemenis involved in the advocacy process, but there are only a very tiny handful, and they sort of come from the civil society elite. We need to broaden that circle. And with that said, Empower Yemen is more than just the YPP's little program. We sort of intend
today, and so I'm going to go really quickly right there.
I'm Richard Oakes from Baltimore Peace Action. If stopping the weapons to Saudis is not the main priority, what is?
It's a good question, and obviously different constituencies within Yemen have different ideas about that. But one thing that you do not hear much from U.S. advocacy organizations and activists is really anything at all about the Houthis, who in fact are the party who started this war in the first place. If you ask a lot of Yemenis what it will take to end the war, part of their answer entails defeating or removing the Houthi regime in the capital. And when we were working on counterterrorism back in the day, We were obviously talking about U.S. drone strikes and U.S. policy, but we were also talking about the dictatorship of Ali Abdullah Saleh, which was, destroying the country and was throwing innocent Yemenis in the path of these drones. So that means that now, if we're going to talk about ending the war, and we're not going to talk about the Houthis and what needs to happen inside Yemen to make peace possible, then we're not doing our job correctly, is what I think. So there's diversity of opinion of what steps need to happen, but if you're going to get to a point where peace is possible in Yemen, if you're going to end the war, that's going to mean more than just ending support for one of the parties to the conflict, because, as Jehan pointed out, before this was an internationalized conflict, this was a civil war. And even without a Saudi-led intervention, even without American bombs falling, there would be a civil war going on right now. And that means that there need to be internal Yemeni solutions, and Americans can play a role in that. We need to listen to Yemenis to figure out how to do it exactly.
I was just going to add that in 2011, I remember having families sending videos of them being at protests, and they were actually calling on Obama to get rid of the Saleh regime and requested assistance from the U.S. But here we are in 2019, and this is what the assistance looks like. And definitely ending the war in Yemen does not look like this type of assistance. I would say that intervention has not been the solution, not for the people of Yemen, not for the interests of the American people, other than lining pockets, hundreds of billions of dollars in arms sales, millions of dollars from training Saudi troops. So I think it's definitely multi-layered, and removing foreign actors would be the first step, and then a sovereign country, which Yemen is, would focus on the internal factions, which consist of the Houthis, the Islah, and many parties.
Yes, I'm wondering, to pick up on the broader theme of U.S. foreign policy, and then specifically as it related to Yemen, is there a counter-narrative being developed to attack this concept of a war on terrorism? Because, that's kind of where that's the umbrella thing that gets us into Yemen and into Afghanistan and all these other places. Certainly with Bush and then Obama as well, Yemen was identified as a refuge for terrorists. And I guess one of the things, if we want to get the U.S. out of the business of attacking these countries or subsidizing attacks on them, we need to attack this undefined war on terror and try to put some limits, or go to Congress and say, look, this is not a legitimate war on terror that you're engaged in. I mean, is that counter-narrative being developed?
Yeah, thank you for that question. And like I mentioned earlier, for MoveOn, ending U.S. involvement in Yemen was to lay the pathway towards saying, listen, if we can win on this fight in a bipartisan way, that means we can set the direct pathway to repealing the 2001 authorization, which is like the quote-unquote war on terror that has been used to have military intervention in dozens of countries at this point, right? And that is really like the root cause of many, many conflicts that are happening. And as we know, the Obama administration was droning Yemen during their reign, right? And it was because of the 2001 authorization. And so, yes, the narrative is out there, and I would say the other narrative that MoveOn has really been pushing is we're careful not to only say end military sales to Saudi Arabia. What we do say is we need to stop selling weapons to regimes with human rights abuses, right? And that broadens the scope of the work automatically, right? Because now, yes, this fight is focused on the Saudi-led coalition, but that's not where it ends, right? And if we can't, we're not going to get there by next year, we might get there in 2 years, we might get there in 10 years, but it is laying the groundwork to make sure that when Democrats have that White House, the Senate, and the House, there is no question that the war on terror was a mistake and that it needs to end, and that voices, prophetic voices like Representative Barbara Lee, who was the sole person, who was the only person to vote against the 2001 authorization, are set in history in their rightful place as like people who should have been listened to, right? So yes, that is definitely a part of the narrative, and maybe we can do a better job of like lifting it up a little bit more.
I think if I can add only really quickly, just as a reminder, the drone warfare program on Yemen has been in place since 2002. Since the Bush administration, it's been 17 years of drones falling on the people of Yemen. So I think, because of it's like we're in rapid response mode, you know what I mean? Like currently, the devastation is happening on the ground, whether it's between local groups and the Hadi government, whether it's from the UAE that's occupying the southern part of Yemen with troops on the ground, whether it's airstrikes falling from above. So, even in war powers resolutions that have been victorious in the past, they were vetoed, but they were victorious for a moment. They don't even talk about that part. That part is removed because it's a separate conversation, and I think it's an even bigger fight. It's definitely something we do not want drones falling on Yemen. But I just think we're looking at it as like, right now, we need to, like Iram said, it's part of the narrative, but we're also being realistic. Policy is hard.
So we're going to have to wrap up, and I'm going to talk for a moment so my panelists can gather their final thoughts on what the story of Yemen tells us about working on foreign policy generally, and we'll let them each have a minute to close. I'll note that folks are obviously welcome to come up and ask additional questions. I know there's some more hands at the end of this panel. And I'll just add, the reason that Win Without War leans so heavily into this fight is exactly this notion that the situation in Yemen is the poster child for everything that's wrong with U.S. foreign policy. Every aspect of what you look at is an encapsulation of what's wrong, from the massive influence in Washington of special interests and arms makers and corporations including foreign governments who spend literally millions of dollars every year to influence the policy in Washington. It is a story about how the real-world impacts of U.S. foreign policy are not felt in America, right? And you can have a situation where America is actively participating in what amounts to the largest case of human suffering on the planet, and most Americans don't experience that in a way that would motivate them to action. It's also the reality that this is how the United States fights wars in the 21st century, right? We are funding, arming, equipping others to fight our wars. That goes horribly wrong, as it did in Yemen. We spent years arming the Saleh regime, who then, when that disintegrated, we were having the Saudis fly American-made bombs, or planes to drop American-made bombs on American-made weapons that we had previously sold Saleh that had ended up in the hands of the Houthis, right? This is the cyclical horror of and the counterproductive nature of what we're doing. It's the reality that 17 years of trying to terrorize people in Yemen to buy ourselves security did neither, right? All it did was cause chaos on the ground and not increase American security one iota. So this is a perfect encapsulation of everything that's wrong, and it is the reason that it is so important to get this right, in addition to the just moral and human realities of the imperatives of this movement. So I wanted to underscore and add that. And I'm going to start with Jehan and go down, and you guys each have about 2 minutes tops to just give us some final thoughts on what you think folks should take away from this work as a lesson for how we work on foreign policy going forward.
Thank you guys for entertaining us for this hour. I think civic engagement is tough. We started out in 2014 protesting. We just took it to the streets. We didn't even know what we were doing. We held up signs and called out to the, called out the Yemeni regime, the government at the time. But as we progressed and evolved, we understood what strategy should look like. We're still learning. And I think outside of being a good ally, listening and following, you know, I think, you know, a lot of the followers of Yemeni Alliance Committee may get so confused because one day we want to pass HCOM Res 81, the next day we want to pass SJ Res 54. And what does all that mean? You know what I mean? And I don't want to confuse you right now, and want to tell you that the House will be voting on the NDAA and all the amendments that we want to push. But I'll tell you that if very easily, right now with social media, you can advocate with the click of a button. You can go on Twitter and you can tag your rep, and all you need to tell them is that I'm your constituent because they work for us, right? We elected them, they are supposed to represent us. Tag your representative and you tell them, you know, you urge them to end U.S. support to the Saudi-led coalition that's bombing Yemen, end U.S. Arms sales to the coalition. And then our hashtag is what we've used all from Yemen to here is hashtag Yemen can't wait. If you're not on Twitter, you can take it to the phone and you can call 202-224-3121. It's the switchboard that connects you to your representative after you put in your zip code. Then you can make a phone call and say, hey, Mr. or Mrs. By the way, I'm not okay with you bombing Yemen. I'm not okay with you selling arms to the coalition. I'm not okay with war because, you know, we are fighting to end the war in Yemen, but we also are not okay with intervention across the board. Hopefully this will pave the way to end endless wars. So tweeting, emailing, calling, getting on social media, a lot of these representatives, they all have handles either on Facebook, Twitter, or Instagram. And also please follow orgs that are doing this work. Because I know sometimes you're like, what do I say? Go to Win Without War, come to Yemeni Alliance Committee, Yemen Peace Project, MoveOn. You can take copy and paste what we say and then share it with your representative or your senator. And I think that's the easiest way that you can kind of get involved without taking it to the streets.
What's the number again?
202-224-3121. It's like my social now.
Don't get that.
Which is. So, you know, going to your question of like, you know, what does Yemen and the advocacy around Yemen tell us about working on foreign policy in general? And I think what it has taught MoveOn especially is that foreign policy cannot be a short-term fight. That's not what this is. We need actually long-term investment in issues like foreign policy, and the way we approach it is completely different, right? So someone might not want to sign a petition saying they don't support the war in Yemen because they don't think that's going to make a difference, right? But which is the case, right? So like the way you measure success and the way you measure momentum shifts drastically if you are involved in foreign policy. So I will share, like, none of our petitions did extremely well on Yemen, right? Or on ending arms sales to Saudi Arabia. But at the end of last year, tens of thousands of MoveOn members donated $175,000 to Doctors Without Borders work in Yemen, right? Like, so shifting our strategies is super important within the foreign policy framework in terms of what works, how people are going to act, and that this is not a one-time thing. Our work on Yemen has focused on inflection points for like the past year and a half now, and it's still probably not going to end, and only more fights will get added onto the docket, and that's why organizations that are working on this for the long haul are especially important. So like organizations like Win Without War, the Yemeni Coalition, and the Yemen Peace Project, right? Like, these are the organizations that are going to keep the fight going, even when MoveOn has like other priorities, right? So that is something that I want you to walk away with, which is like finding the organizations in any grassroots campaigns or issues and really dedicating your time and energy to them.
Final thought about, you know, how progressives can influence policy. So remember that it's constituents and it's voters who communicate to politicians what the political costs of that policy are. Obama's foreign policy in Yemen and the region was terrible, it was a disaster, because he believed that the political cost of a terrorist attack on his watch was higher than the political cost of committing mass murder abroad. You all need to change that calculus for the next Democratic president, for Democratic policymakers to do that.
And speaking of the foreign policy for the next Democratic president, I'm going to end by saying that there's going to be another foreign policy conversation later today at 2:15 in room 119B. Iram Ali and my colleague Kate Kaiser and some others will be talking about foreign policy in the 2020 race. So I just wanted to make sure folks knew that that was coming a little bit later today. Hopefully we'll all have a lot more caffeine and energy by then. But I hope you'll join me in thanking our panelists today, and thank you all for coming out this morning.